how's everybody doing? Thanks for clicking on the video. My name's Cameron Buckner. This is the Dixiecryptid podcast, and all we do is tell stories. This podcast is going to be just a little different than some that I do, the normal, a little bit off the norm. What we're going to do is I'm going to pick out a couple of stories. I'm going to narrate those. A few months ago, Neoma and I interviewed Will Jevening and the Creek Devil crew. We just asked them, shot random questions at them, and they're questions I know those guys get all the time. But Will and Tom were good enough to answer, and I recorded all of it, and I've been breaking that interview up and sprinkling those in podcasts throughout the last 2 or 3 months. I've got 2 more segments left. This particular segment coming up is very interesting to me, and he answers some questions that have been on my mind since I've been doing this channel. You can look forward to that a little bit later in the video. And then last, Neoma Finn has narrated, I think it's the prologue of Lakeview Man 2 by author D.A. Roberts. You know, we did I did the chapter 1, I think it was chapter 1 or the prelude to the Code Wild Hunt Odin's Call book that he did. And people really seem to like it. And I've listened to this narration by Neoma, and she does a great job. Matter of fact, I think she's working on the whole audio book. So that's at the end. So this is a little bit of a variety. I hope you guys enjoy it. I'll shut up now. Let's get rolling. All right, here we go. All right, this first story is from Danny, and he gives me his whole name, and he says I can use his whole name because he writes, I am 65 now, and I don't care what people think anymore. And I'm 59, I'm pushing 60, and I'm kind of like Danny. I don't care what people think about me. I just love doing what I do. I love doing what I love to do. If something's on my mind, as long as it doesn't hurt someone else's feelings, I just say it. So I kind of get Danny's, I get Danny's attitude, but here's what he writes. Back when I was 14 or 15 years old, in the early 70s, we lived on State Route 52 in what is called the Gap of the Ridge area in Macon County, Tennessee. Back then, I spent every free moment I could in the woods, especially in the summer when there was no school. It was on one of those summer days that I had been out hunting groundhogs and enjoying being in the woods more than I was enjoying the actual hunting. It was getting dark, so I decided to head for home. I walked to an old logging road that wound around and up the hill to the highway, and as I turned to start up the hill, I heard something running from behind me and to my left. I spun around to see what was coming. It was dark, solid-color, human-like thing ran from behind a wild rose bush and crossed an open area in a stooped or crouched position. The creature, I call it a creature because at the time I had not heard of Bigfoot, ran all the way across the clearing into the woods on the opposite side and down into a draw where I lost sight of it. I could still hear it, though, as it crashed through the woods, snapping branches and breaking saplings as it ran. The hair stood up all over my body as I watched and listened to the destructive power of that thing. I wasted no time getting up on the logging road to the top of the hill. There I turned back one more time, fired my .22 rifle into the air before yelling and running for home 200 yards away. The next day I went back to where I had seen the creature. The wild rose bush where it had emerged was 6 feet tall. Stooped over like it was, the creature was the same height, so I estimated it to be 7.5 to 8 feet tall standing up. That was the only time I've ever seen it. But I've heard sounds at night that I'm sure came from that creature. A few years after my sighting, I was walking in the same woods one night. All around me were the normal sounds of crickets chirping, frogs croaking, and occasional night bird, and suddenly I realized everything had gone quiet. I stopped in my tracks and I listened for a moment. I began to hear the crunching of dried leaves. As it got louder and closer, I recognized the distinct pattern of a bipedal footstep coming from the hill above me. It kept walking, and I kept listening until the sound got fainter, and I eventually couldn't hear it at all. Immediately, the night woods returned, and I decided it was time for me to go home. Years later, in the 1990s, I was visiting my mom and dad one evening with my wife and kids. I smoked at the time, so I stepped out on the back porch to have a cigarette. And as I stood there, I heard a sound from across the holler that was like some sort of language. It was almost like a samurai warrior talking with grunts and growls thrown in to break up the sentences. And at the time, I had no idea what I was hearing. And then one night, a few months later, I was listening to Art Bell's show on the radio. He had a guest on who was talking about recording Bigfoot languages. When he played the recording, it was the same thing I heard that night in my mom and dad's backyard. Most recently, though I didn't see or hear anything, I found evidence of them being in the area. I currently live about 12 miles from where I had my other experiences. I was walking on an old logging road that serves as a driveway to my neighbor's summer house when they're up from Florida, and while walking I observed a 15-foot tall cedar tree that had been twisted until it broke halfway up the trunk, with the twisted part hanging down. I assume a Bigfoot did this to mark its territory and to send a message to me or another Bigfoot to tread lightly. I got the message loud and clear. Well, those are my experiences. Feel free to use my name, and thank you. Well, Danny, thank you for that email. You know, there's always one or two things that stand out in my head with these letters. You know, I read Bigfoot experiences all the time, but Art Bell's ringing in my head right now. And man, my two young sons, when they were younger, used to listen to Art Bell at night, I think in their bedroom or when they were out. And if we were going hunting, you know, we'd get up at 2 or 3 in the morning to drive 4 hours to a place to hunt. They would say, Dad, turn on Art Bell. And we all just loved Art Bell. And it was so late that I didn't get to listen to all of his shows. And I think they're out there somewhere on the internet where we can listen to them. But I really miss listening to Art Bell. But the people who took his place, they do a great job. There's other podcasts that I'll listen to that are similar. I'm not like obsessive on them, but every once in a while I go, that sounds good, and I'll pull it up. So anyway, Art Bell brought back some memories for me with my kids. I'm glad he said it in the story. But those are great encounters, Danny. Thanks for sending this email. You the man. You the man for being 65 and not caring what people think anymore. I like that. All right, let's move on to another one. Okay, here's an email I got from, he gives me his name, but he doesn't say to use his name or not, so I'm just not going to. But when he hears this, he'll know it's him. He'll know it's his email. He writes, I'm a Cree Indian born in Saskatchewan, Canada. When I was 3 months old, we moved to British Columbia, where from an early age of 4, my grandfather would pick me up every day of hunting season and take me with him to get a moose. Of course, it was 99% road hunting because I was too young to be walking old log cuts and skidder trails. Regardless, I spent thousands of hours in the bush with my grandfather. As I grew older, my grandfather would pick me up after school each day to hunt. And on weekends, we were in the bush from morning until night. We had our favorite spot, and we were successful year after year. When I was 7, I was considered old enough to be given a .32 Winchester Special, a gun that I still own to this day. I've always been a big boy, so I was not bothered by the recoil. I used it to kill my first bull moose when I was 8. Once I was old enough to carry a weapon, my grandfather felt we would be more successful parking the truck and walking for hours into old cuts or hidden swamps. One morning in 1979, the year I was finally old enough to drive legally, we pulled up to an old skiddered trail that we had walked many times. It led to an old logging area that was like a magnet for moose. I dropped Grandpa off there and drove to another spot. I promised to be back in 2 hours to pick him up, and he promised to be waiting on the road when I got there. At 16, I was now carrying a 7mm mag. My grandfather had taught me about bears and what to do if they charged. My grandfather was a wise old hunter, and he said if a bear charged, to drop down on one knee so that I was on the same level as the bear, and then I would not miss if I had to shoot. I parked my truck and walked into my spot where it was very quiet. There I found a good vantage point and sat for an hour. During that time, I saw only a cow with twins. Not being in rut yet, I doubted any bull would be hanging around. It was time to go back and get Grandpa, so I hiked back out and drove back to the spot where I knew he would be waiting. My grandfather was always punctual. If he said he would be in a certain place at a certain time, he would be there. But this time, he was nowhere to be seen. I hadn't heard any shots, so I was pretty sure that he wasn't cleaning a bull. When 45 minutes had passed and he didn't come out of the woods, I began to worry. Grandpa was diabetic. I started thinking maybe he was in a medical distress, so I decided to drive down the skidder trail to find him. It was only about 3/4 of a mile to a clearing that was about 500 yards wide and 800 yards long where I parked and got out. The area was dotted with small trees and a few rolling mounds, but I could otherwise see as far as 150 yards around me. I started walking in the direction I thought Grandpa might be, reminding myself not to yell out as I went in case he might be onto something. 10 minutes into my walk, I noticed a powerful stench that I couldn't recognize, but I was too concerned about my grandfather to give it much thought. It was a quiet day, and a couple of minutes later, I noticed the sound of footsteps running away from me somewhere around 60 yards to my left. A mound blocked my line of sight, so I didn't see what it was. After 10 seconds, it stopped, and I needed to find my grandfather, so I dismissed it. A few more minutes passed, and I found my grandfather. He was sitting on a stump, looking pale. I said, "Grandpa, you don't look good. Is it your sugar?" He said there was nothing wrong with his sugar, and then asked if I had walked all the way in or if I drove. I told him the truck was only about 15 minutes away, so we started our walk out. I tried to get him to tell me what was wrong, but he wouldn't say. When I changed the subject by telling him about the horrible stench I had smelled not 5 minutes from where we were, he perked up. I described the smell to him, and then I told him about hearing something running, but that I didn't see what it was. To my surprise, he grabbed my arm and said, "Be on alert, but if you see anything strange, do not shoot at it." And I gave him a startled look, unsure of how to react, and he dropped his hand, looked down, and started moving again before adding, "Just keep walking." Well, this frightened me, and I don't scare easily. Neither did my grandfather, but there was no doubt that something had him worried. We made it back to the truck, and I saw that someone or something had broken off the antenna and the windshield wipers. Oh, I was furious. I'm 6'3" and 255 pounds, and I was a force to be reckoned with when it came to someone causing harm to my family or our property. I never heard of vehicle, so I assumed that whatever did this was on foot. I took off running to the main road, hoping to catch the culprit before they got away. I didn't get 50 steps before Grandpa called out to me to stop. Obediently, I went back to him, and as I did so, I noticed that the road around the truck was smeared as if someone was trying to hide their tracks. I pointed this out and asked why he thought that might be. He said he didn't know, and he urged me to get in the truck and get us out of there. Grandpa never spoke a word all the way home, which was completely out of character for him. Our drives home were generally filled with conversation about the day, what we'd seen or what we had not seen and why. But that wasn't the case today. It only served to increase my concern. Later, I spoke with my two uncles about Grandpa's behavior. I often hunted with them when I wasn't with Grandpa, and I thought they might have some insight. I told them everything that happened that day. One uncle said maybe he saw a Sasquatch, and he started laughing. My other uncle was a lot more attentive, though. Instead of laughing, he told me about a terrifying experience Grandpa had in 1963 when we first moved to British Columbia. He said Grandpa was alone in the McGregor area, northeast of Prince George, when he was approached by something. He was sitting on the edge of a tree line overlooking a clearing when he heard it coming from about 100 yards in the bush and heading straight for him. He thought it might be a grizzly because of the heavy footsteps, but it was walking, not running. My grandfather held his position with the safety off until all at once he saw a giant 10-foot tall monster on 2 feet step into his view. It didn't see him sitting there as still and as quiet as a church mouse. The creature walked into the clearing just 15 feet from Grandpa, still unaware of him. Then the wind shifted slightly, and it turned its head and locked eyes with my grandfather. It started sniffing steadily, and then it dropped down to a crouching position. Grandpa was terrified. He didn't know if it was preparing to attack him or what it was going to do. In any case, he was sure that he was about to die. He slowly stood up from the stump, and the monster reared back and roared right into Grandpa's face. He felt the breath of its roar as it resonated through his body. He knew his 270 pounds was no match for this thing, and then it just stood there growling at him until he lowered his rifle, and that seemed to settle it a bit. Grandpa didn't know whether to run, walk away, or stay put. After what he was sure had to be 10 minutes, he heard something else way back in the trees making a sound he had never heard. The Sasquatch took note of the sounds and grunted one more time at my grandfather before it went back into the woods in the direction the sound had come from. Grandpa took the opportunity and ran like the wind back to his truck. It was a mile away. I understand about the ridicule people experience from non-believers, because when my grandfather would tell people about what happened, they would all laugh and say he was a nut and shouldn't be in the bush with a rifle. After a while, he just quit telling the story. He never spoke of it. I spent a lot of time with my grandfather. I knew his character, and I know he would not have lied about this. Once I'd heard the story, my next trip with Grandpa was filled with questions. He didn't want to talk about it until I said, "I believe that you saw what you saw, and I need to know what you know about these things so I'll have some idea of what to do if I ever encounter one." That seemed to do the trick. He told me he had never seen or heard or smelled another one until that day that I found him as white as a ghost, and then he went on to tell me what had happened that day. He said he'd reached the clearing 10 minutes before daylight, and almost immediately he heard a large tree break. There was no wind, so this puzzled him, but he decided to walk towards the sound, thinking it might be a big bull scraping his antlers on a tree. Once he figured that he was close enough, he sat and waited a few more minutes for shooting light. Even after he could see clearly, he waited for movement because he knew whatever had made the tree break was close. He didn't see anything move, but he was suddenly aware that he was being watched. Terrified now, he began to panic as the thought of his first experience flashed through his mind. He stayed frozen to the stump he was sitting on, and that's when he was overcome by a disgusting odor. Now he was on full alert. 2 minutes later, one of these things stood up 50 feet away from him. It was staring right at him. He could tell it was perturbed that he was there, and it kept looking back towards the tree line. Then Grandpa caught movement to his left as another, smaller one stood up. It was only about 6 feet tall. The big one beside Grandpa started making weird noises, and the little one answered it. And then the little one turned and went straight back down the trail Grandpa had come up. The larger one waited until the juvenile was out of sight and then walked right past Grandpa and followed the same trail the little one did. Grandpa said he was in shock and couldn't get his legs to move. He tried, but he was frozen to the stump. He was sure they were still close by when I showed up 2.5 hours later because of the stench I smelled. Hunting was my grandfather's way of life. He said he didn't want to tell me what had happened because he was worried that I wouldn't want to hunt anymore. He couldn't have been more wrong. My passion for hunting is just as strong as his, and I would never let anything stop me from being in the bush. I did eventually have my own encounters with them. I saw one once and I've heard them on 4 other occasions. But those are stories for another time. Well, to the writer, this is a fantastic story, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking the time to share this with all of us. I mean, it is fascinating. 2 things. I'm glad your passion for hunting is not gone. Matter of fact, it's probably stronger. That activity is inherent in our DNA. We are hunters. We're killers. Human beings are hunters, and that's what we do. We take animals for food. That's what we do. And this is strong. This is a strong urge in this guy, and I really respect that. The last thing I want to say is you did have your own encounters. I would love to hear from you again if I haven't already. I have your name. I'm going to look you up in my email list and try to respond to this because I would love to hear about your own encounters. But this was great. This is great. Up in the Pacific Northwest, Bigfoot. That's a real active area for Bigfoot. I think they're pretty scary up there from what I understand. But anyway, this is a great story. I could go on and on about it, but I'll stop. I really appreciate the writer sending it. Cree Indian. Born in Saskatchewan, moved to British Columbia when he was 4, and he learned to hunt there. That's awesome. Awesome story. Thank you. Prior to 1967 in the Patterson-Gimlin event, Sasquatch was a legend. It just was stories. That was the evidence that now we're looking at this from the general population, not from your point of view, guys. So, but now with the advent of better footage and video and the availability of technology and audio and things of that nature, more and more evidence surfaces each year. That there's some of it's hard to verify and some of it's not. But the species is still not recognized by, I say, zoologists, departments of wildlife, and university biology departments. In other words, it's, in most people's minds, it's still a myth. And so my question is, through your study and field work and being associated with knowledgeable people in your studies and your gathering of information, what's your opinion of the current state of Sasquatch being recognized as a species?
You know, my personal opinion is it's getting worse each year. And what I mean by that is because all the junk it gets, but I mean, with pictures and things, the first red flag that goes up for me is, what did that person do with the picture? The very first thing they did, they put it on Facebook, Instagram, or wherever. Okay, legitimate pictures. I have what I feel are legitimate pictures by witnesses, some very good ones. They wanted nothing to do with the picture. They would absolutely not want it out in public. And this is across the board with people who have taken what I think are legitimate photographs. They've all had the same response. They don't want the attention. They don't want any association with it. So when they're out in public, YouTube, wherever, I have to really, think hard about the legitimacy of many of those.
Right.
So having said that, people in position of authority and what have you, it's a career killer if you pay attention to these kinds of things, whether you're police, academics, what have you. So they tend to shy away from it. So the more this stuff comes out, the worse or the farther away it gets from being recognized.
Yeah. Is it going to take a specimen captured or killed?
I have a good friend who's a forensic anthropologist. He used to teach in the Bay Area here in California and testified, throughout the court system here. So he's, very knowledgeable, widely respected. And he told me, I asked him that once, and he says, look, people may not like it, but it happens all the time. Scientists do it routinely with animal species. So should one be taken? He says, yes. Will it be a big deal to the scientific community? No, in terms of the actual taking. But he said that's probably what it would require.
Yeah, it would have to. I mean, if you think of any species that's been studied, they have to have a specimen. Study the anatomy and
Yeah, I think it could be proven in other ways. I'm sort of have my own plans for that, but I'll leave that for the moment. That's something I'll address probably next year.
Okay. Okay.
So we'll just
Great.
kind of leave it at that.
Yeah, something to look forward to. I guess that's the question that stays forefront in my mind because, in what I do, which is namely 99% just sharing encounter stories that I have no way to verify if they're true. However, I think there's something there, and I actually think there have been specimens captured or either killed or captured, more than likely killed, and I think they've been studied. Now, why, if that's the case, why it's not made big public news is another story that I don't think any of us really know why. I mean, I don't think it's a nefarious thing. I think it's maybe to protect the species, whatever. I mean, there are hundreds of opinions out there on that, but I really do think there have been specimens captured, maybe not captured, but probably killed. So
Before we move on, I just want to jump in quick. Will, you do have a story of a couple that were, I think they're possibly in British Columbia. They're on a canoe trip.
Oh, that was John Green's story, actually. Yeah, one of John Green's books. There was a couple in British Columbia, and I believe they were accountants or something along that line. But once a year, they would go trapping on their vacation. So they took a canoe, and I don't remember off the top of my head where it was, but on western British Columbia, they canoed into an area where they did some prospecting, and on the way out, they found a half-decomposed corpse of one of these creatures near the edge of the water. And a discussion ensued where the wife wanted to take part of the creature back. The husband didn't want to. He said there was no room in the canoe. So clandestinely, she smuggled the jawbone into one of the packs without him knowing about it. And it sat in their mantle place for 14 years, where people would come over and they could put the jaw, it fit completely over their faces, and then the house burnt down and it was lost. Our anthropologist, John, he speculates that there are many places, if a single bone is found and it's a human bone, it's not, not going to some cold case file. Oftentimes they just go to, facilities that collect these things and they sit there and collect dust. And there could be Sasquatch bones in there because he said they would and should somewhat resemble human bones in many aspects. So the person finding them may simply misidentify them, and he said there could be dozens of them stored away in boxes no one will ever look at.
Oh, that's interesting. I just have the hardest time believing that this creature exists, and people will say, well, why is there never a body or never bones or whatever found? Well, I think they have been found. I just don't think it's...
They have been.
Yeah.
And even Green put in his books, there were numerous examples, over the past 200 years where bodies were found. A juvenile was even captured in 1882.
Right.
The Jacko story.
Jacko?
Yeah.
One of the questions I got, and you can answer or not, but I don't know how you would know, but maybe you do. But people are wondering: where do they live? In caves, underground? Do you have an opinion on that, or any?
I've looked, especially I worked the area south of Mount St. Helens for about a dozen years through the late 80s and 90s, and that region is absolutely honeycombed with lava tubes. So there's lots and lots of caves. I never once found evidence in any of them that anything lived there. They appear now, observing. I tracked a group for that dozen years in that region, and they would move about every 2 weeks. They'd go into an area, they would hunt and feed, and then they would move on. So they seem to be on the move all the time. Weather doesn't seem to bother them, and that's probably because they were very successful during the last ice age, as part of the megafauna. And, he's, in fact, even tracks, always going from, where there were snow lines, they would go from the lower areas where you would think they would want to be where it's warmer, they would go up into the snowfields, and that's where they'd stay. So The weather doesn't seem to bother them.
The Lakeview Man, First Duty by D.A. Roberts. Prelude, We Face What You Fear, Anonymous. 11:40 p.m. Central Standard Time, March 7th, Silver Dollar City, Missouri. There's nothing more empty feeling than a theme park when it's closed. Silver Dollar City was no exception to that rule, especially when all of the attractions were closed and there was no one in the park except for a few security officers patrolling through the darkened streets. It was a modern theme park full of marvelous rides and high-tech equipment meant to both amuse and entertain the hundreds of thousands of guests the park hosted each year. But it was also a theme park based in the latter half of the 19th century. That meant for all the high-tech rides, there were just as many, if not more, buildings and crafts that looked like they had been built around the time of the Civil War. Blacksmiths could be found plying their trades. Musicians played in the style of the day, using largely acoustic instruments. All of the employees of the park wore clothing appropriate to the period. You could even find places that served food cooked in the old-fashioned ways, giving you a pleasing meal and a taste of nostalgia all at once. Those who worked in or around the park tended to love it and their jobs there. That's not something you can say about most places in the world. There was just something about the place that was more than just an attraction, more than just a theme park. To many of the employees, it was home. Tim Butler worked in security on the overnight shift. He was unarmed since all of the park's security who carried firearms were off-duty police officers. The unarmed security officers were not trained police officers, so the park did not allow them to carry a weapon while patrolling. All of the security officers shared in the responsibilities around the park. On the overnights, those included checking for intruders, responding to alarms, patrolling the park, inspecting the fire extinguishers monthly, unlocking gates at certain times, and escorting the money when it was moved in or out of the park. During the money transfers was the only time the unarmed security officers were allowed to be armed. They carried a 12-gauge shotgun during those times. Unfortunately for Tim, this was not one of those times. The park had closed at sundown and had emptied rapidly. By 9 o'clock a fog was rolling in and there was no one left in the park except for a few security officers and a handful of maintenance personnel. By 11 o'clock the fog was dense and the population was even further reduced to just 3 security officers. Only 2 of those were armed, but they all carried radios. Now it was nearly midnight and they'd already completed their rounds and inspections for the night. All they had to do for the remainder of their shift was to do the occasional patrol and stay awake. Most nights in the park, staying awake was the most difficult task they would face. Tim had grown bored playing with his phone and left the security office to go for a walk. The fog was so thick he could only see a few feet in any direction. Beyond that, it was just shapes and shadows. He was alone in the mist, and he could almost imagine that he was the last person on Earth. It was eerily quiet tonight. That was fine with him because he knew the park like the back of his hand. He'd worked here for 5 years and planned to work here as long as he could. His father had worked here for almost 25 years, and it had only taken Tim about a week to understand why. He loved it here. There was a serenity here, like few other places he'd ever experienced. There were just enough lights on in the park that he could navigate without his flashlight. Some people found the park spooky when it was closed, but Tim relished the solitude. There was a peaceful feeling that he always had in the park. There was a calmness to the place. Maybe that was what everyone felt here. A lot of people who worked here claimed that the place was haunted and even had told of seeing ghosts walking the streets of the city. Despite walking through the park nightly for the last 5 years, Tim had never seen anything he couldn't explain. Sure, there were a lot of things like feral cats, raccoons, opossums, and the occasional deer, but never anything paranormal, at least not that he'd ever seen. There were lots of stories, though. Tim wandered through the empty streets of the park, passing the town square and the general store. Then he found himself passing the old Wilderness Chapel. It always made him feel good to see that church. It had been here since long before there was a theme park. There had been a settlement on this spot for more than 100 years before the park was built. Moving down towards the shops and restaurants on the lower end of the park, he suddenly felt like he might not be alone tonight. He thought it was just his imagination until he realized that something was different. The feeling of the area had changed. There was a hint of something rancid in the air. It was very faint, but lingering. God, I hope I don't run into a skunk in the fog, he thought. The last thing I need is to get sprayed. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the fog. After all, things tend to echo differently in the mist. But echoes don't change position and speed. With each step he took, he heard the sound of someone else walking. They were timing their steps to his so he wouldn't notice them. Tim was observant and had felt their presence before he even realized he'd actually heard the sound. A brief flash of fear ran through him as he felt the strange anxiety welling up within him. Then he relaxed. It was probably one of the other officers messing with him. The security department had a long history of playing pranks on one another when they were alone in the park. He stopped dead in his tracks and listened, catching just the hint of sound. It was as if they took another step after he stopped, but forced themselves to put their foot down very gently. If he hadn't been listening for it, he wouldn't have noticed it. "Very funny, guys," he said, loud enough that they could easily hear him. He waited for any sound from the others to verify his theory, but they didn't say a word. He felt the anxiety starting to tighten in his chest again. What if it wasn't them? Then he had another idea. Grabbing his radio, he keyed up and released the button immediately. If it was one of the others, their radio would make a noise that he would hear in the stillness of the fog. Several seconds passed, and there was nothing. They must have turned off their radios, he thought. He waited for a moment, listening for any sound, but all he could hear was his heart beating in his chest. Then, softly, he heard someone exhale. It could have been an animal, though. He'd heard deer make a sighing noise many different times. Suddenly a thought occurred to him. 424 to 410, he said into the radio. 410, go ahead, came the voice of Bill Masterson, one of the other officers. Are either of you guys down near the log flume ride? He asked. No, said Bill. I'm at the desk in the security office and 402 is in the bathroom. Why, do you need us for something? In the background of the transmission, Tim could hear the toilet flush. That verified what Bill had said. Charlie was in the bathroom. Then who the hell was following him? Negative, said Tim. I was just checking. I thought I heard something nearby. It's probably a deer, said Bill. I've been seeing a lot of them in the park lately. Tim figured he had to be right. They were in a theme park that was surrounded by thick Ozarks woodlands. Wild animals were running around all the time. Yeah, said Tim, you're right. It's just so foggy I couldn't see anything. I wouldn't worry about it, said Bill. I'll check the cameras in your area and see if I can see something. With the fog, I doubt I'll find anything, though. Copy, thanks, said Tim. Out. Tim clipped the radio back on his belt and listened for a few moments. When he didn't hear anything else, he headed on farther down through the park. After a few seconds, the footsteps started again. This time he was actively listening for them, and he was certain that they were there. It wasn't an echo, and it wasn't a deer. No deer walks on two legs. Reaching down on his belt, he pulled his Streamlight ProTac HL5X flashlight out of its holster. He didn't light it up, but he wanted to have it ready. He continued walking until he was between two buildings, then he suddenly stopped and whirled around. Behind him, he saw a shadow in the mist vanish behind one of the buildings. It looked like a man, but he had to have been huge, although he thought the shadows might have been playing tricks on his mind, distorting the size. Racing over to where the form disappeared, he turned the corner and clicked on the flashlight. The 3500 lumen light illuminated the fog like a high-intensity searchlight. The thick fog lit up, and all he could see was a wall of pure white light reflected directly back at him. Cutting off the light, he blinked to try and restore his night vision. He could hear the scuffing sounds of someone moving around the far side of the building. There was a lingering smell in the air like a wet dog mixed with feces. It was horrible and burned his nasal passages. Turning back into the main aisle, he glanced in that direction to catch a glimpse of the shadow in the distance disappearing around the corner of the old-time photos building. Now he was certain. There was someone in the park. 424 to 410, he said into the radio as he pursued the retreating shadow. I've got someone inside the park. They just rounded the corner near the photo shop, headed towards the fireman's landing. Are you sure you saw someone? Asked Bill. I'm sure, said Tim. I'm following them right now. We'll grab the Gator 1 and head your way, said Bill. Tim started jogging to catch up to the rapidly retreating shadow. He saw it turn the corner by the oven-baked pizza shop and head down towards the Outlaw Run roller coaster. He could still smell the fetid odor. It didn't seem to be fading away. "I've got you now," he thought. "The only way you can get out of there is back the way you came." Increasing his speed to a run, he keyed up the mic and transmitted a quick update. "We're heading towards Outlaw Run," he said. "Copy," said Bill. The sound of the Gator's engine running in the background reassured Tim that help was on the way. Where did he go? He thought as he approached an area called Wilson's Farm. He can't have gotten far. The only way out is either over a 10-foot fence or through the locked gate. Otherwise, he has to come back this way. Rounding a corner near a concessions booth, he thought he saw movement closer to the roller coaster. Before he could decide where the person had gone, something grabbed him by the left arm at the shoulder and lifted him off the ground like he was a toy. He felt himself being lifted into the air, but he couldn't tell how high. All he knew was he couldn't touch the ground with his feet. Whoever it was had to be incredibly strong because they were only using one hand to lift him. As it turned him around, he found himself face to face with something out of a nightmare. It resembled a man crossed with an ape. It was clearly not a man, but it also looked too human to be an animal. It shifted its grip and wrapped both arms around him in a bear hug, trapping both of his arms in its grip. He was held tight and he couldn't move. The smell was overpowering now. The creature reeked so badly it burned his eyes. "What the hell are you?" he managed to choke out through the fear and panic. It didn't answer. Instead, it began to squeeze. Its strength was incredible. He could feel the air being forced out of his lungs. Then he heard the unmistakable sound of his back popping, followed by his ribs and spine snapping like twigs. It continued to squeeze until it had shattered most of his spine, both upper arms, and his entire rib cage. Although he knew he was dying, Tim felt a calm detachment. He couldn't draw a breath and the pain was already fading away. The creature just held him there, gazing into his eyes as the light slowly faded from them. Just before he lost consciousness, he heard the sound of the Gator's engine. It was getting closer by the second. He could see the look of recognition in the creature's eyes. It had heard the engine too. Then he lost all conscious thought, and the world faded to black for Tim Butler. His last thoughts were peaceful. He was dying in the place he loved. Dropping Tim's lifeless body to the ground, the creature took 2 massive steps and vaulted over the high wooden fence. Then it sprinted off through the trees at incredible speed. By the time the gator arrived and they found Tim's body, the creature was long gone. Only the stillness of the park remained. As their headlights fell on Tim's twisted form, they both jumped out of the gator with their pistols drawn. The only sign that the creature had even been there was the lingering smell in the air.
Okay, that's going to wind this podcast up. Thank you guys for listening. If you like this stuff, consider hitting the subscribe button. I've never asked anyone to do that, but in our analytics, I'm seeing a lot of people are dropping by and they're either forgetting or not. And if you're not interested, that's not a problem. But if you want to hear more of these, just click that subscribe button and hit that little bell next to it. You'll get a notification every time I upload a new podcast. I'd appreciate that. All right, we'll see you guys on the next one. I really appreciate you. Hope you have a good week. Talk to you soon.